Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with your Alaska weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast, check out watches, warnings, advisories that we have out for the state there. You can also call our weather info line at 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to our forecast through that means as well. You can also email us down at the bottom here, and you can check us out on Facebook and on Twitter. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at the fire danger that is out for the state. We have some high areas of danger out in the southwestern part of the state, especially in the Yukon Delta area. As we move up on parts of the Seward Peninsula, we have some areas of fire danger. Much of the western part of the interior extending out to central and northeastern parts into the upper Yukon Valley there, parts of the western Brooks Range and far western parts of the Arctic Slope. And then some smaller areas out by the south central area and the Copper River Basin there. Most extreme areas, western part of the interior extending out towards that upper Yukon Valley area. And we do actually have 34 active fires out for the state. The bulk of those are in this corridor from the southwestern part of the state up towards areas of the southern interior. Starting off with our satellite imagery, we'll start off in the very western parts of the area. We do have our low pressure system that's spinning up towards the western Aleutian Islands and really starting to stall out there. As you can see, we have a lot of higher pressure out over the central and eastern parts of the Bering Sea there, which is really stalling this system with that front draped out over the central Aleutian Islands. Not expected to go much further than that, as that high pressure is holding it in check. As we move off towards the Gulf of Alaska area, we can see we have one low pressure system here, and as this one pushes south, we want to watch along this frontal boundary as we have a new low that's going to spin up that's heading towards our area. You can see it here really starting to head towards the eastern parts of the Gulf, bringing in a lot more moisture and warmer air from the south, really stretching into parts of southeastern Alaska. Then along the Gulf coastline, we're seeing more rain there, continued primarily along the coast from this system as it moves up. And we can see some of the cloud cover with the previous system still hanging around there for a lot of the southern part of the state. And we can also see some of these areas where we have some showers popping up throughout much of the interior, up towards the western parts of the Brooks Range there. And as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we can see what a lot of that convection is doing, bringing us some thunderstorms out there in the Yukon Delta area, pushing towards Galena area, and then off to eastern parts of the interior as well. And we actually more recently have some thunderstorms popping up in the very western parts of the Brooks Range as well. But our system that's coming up in the eastern Gulf, like I said, bringing up a lot of rain with it, primarily going to impact the coastlines with more interior locations in the inside waters of the southeast. Going to see some more showery activity there in parts of the south central and down into the southwestern part of the state. Again, going to see some showers, but the heavier stuff is going to stay on the Gulf side. And Kodiak Island will see some rain from that as well. All the way up north, temperatures still pretty cold. Dominant high pressure up there over the Arctic, bringing in some snow along the Arctic coastline. And as we look way out west, we have our last system here out by the western Aleutian Islands, really stalling there, but it's front bringing in some rain to the central Aleutian Islands. As we move into the nighttime hours, we have that low still sitting out there by the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some rain to those areas. But we have some fog developing now in the central and eastern parts of the Bering Sea, going to linger around there through much of the night into tomorrow morning. As we look out back towards the Gulf, our system that was in the eastern Gulf has now moved out towards the western Gulf Kodiak Island area as the other system pushed to the south, moving in the front more along the coastline, bringing more rain to areas of the Panhandle and along the North Gulf Coast, with some of the lighter rain making it a little bit further inland into Bristol Bay area, up into places in the south central and more interior locations of the Panhandle. Otherwise in the state, we have some lingering light snow along the Arctic coastline, but much of the interior should be without rain for tonight. As we move into Wednesday, Especially in the morning time, we're going to have fog lingering along the coast of the Arctic coastline. But as we go down into the Gulf, lighter rain throughout the Gulf with even lighter showers as we move to more interior locations. Going to see those showers popping up, especially in the afternoon hours throughout much of the south central southern parts of the interior. And as we move out towards the YK Delta area, afternoon and evening thunderstorms expected out there. Should be isolated, but we are looking at the potential threat for some convective activity. Bristol Bay area, some showers out there tomorrow, especially in the afternoon hours, and then that fog lingering through much of the morning time in the central and eastern parts of the Bering Sea, with our low out by the western Aleutian Islands continuing to just sit and spin out there, bringing more rain to the western Aleutians. That is also going to be true on Thursday, even though this system is really weakening now, still going to bring in some rain out to the western Aleutians with a new system coming up from the south, bringing some rain back to the central Aleutian Islands. Lingering fog out in the central and eastern part of the Bering Sea, especially in the morning hours, with some shower activity again, especially in the afternoon time, and that is for southwest Alaska through much of the south central area. And in the afternoon and evening for the YK Delta, expecting another chance for some thunderstorms out there. And then all the way through the Gulf coastline and down into the Panhandle area, expecting to see some rain on Thursday. Arctic coastline should finally start to break away from some of that fog and snow as we move into Thursday. Temperatures as of this afternoon, upper 50s to the mid 60s for the most part for the Panhandle. Yakutat a little bit warmer there, 68 degrees. Mid 50s to around 60s for much of the south central. A little bit colder there at Kodiak 48, Middleton Island as well. And a little bit warmer there for Glen Allen area, 65 degrees. Moving into the interior, many of the temperatures now getting into the 70s, where we can start to see a lot of that convection happening with those warmer temperatures. But a little colder there in the pass, 46 degrees. Right around freezing for most locations along the Arctic coastline. And as we move into Kotzebue Sound area, 50s to 60s there, with Shishmaref being a little bit colder as of 2 p.m. this afternoon, 39 degrees. In the Norton Sound area, mid 60s for the most part. Southwest Alaska, lower 60s, and in the Bristol Bay area, primarily in the upper 50s, right around 50 degrees in the Alaska Peninsula, getting warmer as we get closer to Unalaska, 57 degrees there. And then in the mid 40s and finally around 40 as we move out through the Aleutian Islands. St. Paul at 56, St. George at 50. As we move for lows tonight, staying right around 40 degrees for many of the Aleutian Islands and the Pribilof Islands areas. Alaska Peninsula should drop down into the mid 40s, mid to upper 40s for the Bristol Bay area, mid to upper 40s for the YK Delta area as well, and the Seward Peninsula. Along the Arctic coastline, we are going to have temperatures dropping just below freezing, right around 30 degrees there. Things staying pretty warm in the interior, only dropping to right around 50 degrees for lows tonight. And as we move into the south central, dropping a little bit lower into the mid to upper 40s for most locations, which will be similar for what we expect to see in the Panhandle for lows tonight. As we move to highs for tomorrow, primarily around 60 degrees, getting into the mid 60s for some locations like Sitka there, 65 degrees expected high for tomorrow. Into the mid 60s for many locations in the south central as we get further inland, around 70 degrees. Talkeetna is 71 expected high for tomorrow. In the interior, widespread 70s, getting into the mid 70s at some locations. As we see Fairbanks there around 72 degrees, and then as we move up past the Brooks Range, staying pretty cold there under the effects of that high pressure, just bringing cold air into the area, only getting up to the mid 30s. Then as we move down the west coast of the state, all getting up to right around 70 degrees until we get by the water, staying much more cool out there, only around 50 degrees for many locations, with Gamble only getting up to 40 degrees for tomorrow. Bristol Bay area up to 65. And then as we move out into the Aleutian Islands, dropping from the mid 50s to the mid 40s, especially as we get out there towards Shemya, 46 expected high for tomorrow, and then St. Paul going to get up to around 50 degrees. For our aviation forecast, we have our low pressure system out west and its frontal system bringing in some MVFR and IFR conditions to much of the central and western Bering and Aleutians. Our systems out in the Gulf bring a lot of MVFR conditions with some more isolated areas of IFR conditions tomorrow morning. And then with our snow and fog up along the coastline, expecting to see a widespread MVFR and IFR conditions along the Arctic coast. And as we move into the afternoon, a lot of that's going to stay there under the effects of that strong high pressure further to the north, along the north slope. And then as we move down into the Gulf of Alaska area, we are going to have some of those IFR conditions diminish throughout the day, and you can see in the Panhandle we're actually going to go back to some VFR conditions with some isolated thunderstorms popping up in the YK Delta area in the afternoon. With our system out west, going to continue to see the MVFR and IFR conditions. Taking a look now at our passes, starting up north, Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass should both be VFR throughout the day. As we move a little bit further south, Lake Clark and Merrill, both MVFR as well as Rainy Pass. Then Windy, VFR, Isabel, VFR, and Mintasta, all VFR for tomorrow. But as we drop down towards the Gulf again, Tenita Pass, MVFR conditions expected tomorrow, and Portage Pass, we are going to see IFR conditions improving to MVFR as we move into the afternoon. Chukut and White, as we saw on the previous images, starting off IFR but improving all the way to VFR in the afternoon. As we look at our freezing lines, we can see some warmer air out west, but we can see the lows that came up are cold core lows. We can see those lower freezing levels indicating that. As we look at our surface freezing line, that is way up to the north around the Brooks Range. And then we have some colder air with our far western bearing low that is bringing in some more cold air to the western Aleutian Islands. And as we look at our icing primarily over the southern mainland, extending into the Panhandle area, out over the Bristol Bay area between 5,000 and 8,000 feet. Getting up a little bit higher as we push into the southern parts of the interior between 7,000 and 10,000 feet, and that is going to hold true as we move down to areas closer towards Yakutat. But then as we get to much of the southeast part of the state, we are going to get between 9,000 and 12,000 feet for icing there. For our jet stream, the main part of the jet is going to stay south of the area, but getting pretty close to the central Aleutian Islands, 130 knots out of a westerly direction. And then as it comes back up towards the Panhandle area, southerly about 100 knots there. That's what's helping push up that next low off that frontal system that we have out in the eastern Gulf of Alaska right now. And that's going to exit out the eastern part of the state around 75 knots. As we drop down to 9,000 feet, primarily southeasterly flow, becoming a little bit more easterly out over the state. Strongest winds in the eastern part of the Gulf there, around 50 knots, dropping down to 40 knots as we go over the Kenai Peninsula, and then exiting out there in the eastern part of the Alaska Peninsula, around 40 knots out of that northerly direction, but dropping down pretty quickly as we move through the state all the way to around 10 knots over the Brooks Range, but picking up slightly along the Arctic coastline, around 15 knots out there. With our other low out over the western part of the Bering Sea, 40 knots right around that low, getting as high as 55 on the northern side of the low, but dropping down to around 15 to 20 knots as we get more into the high pressure area. Moving down to 3,000 feet, strongest winds around this low, getting up to as high as 45 knots now on the southern side over the western Aleutian Islands, but dropping down pretty quickly to around 10 knots as we get closer to the central Aleutian Islands, or calmer winds as we get towards the Pribilof Islands, and becoming easterly as we get further to the north around the Bering Strait area. Similarly to the 9,000 feet winds, we had a southeasterly flow through much of the state, and the strongest winds there are going to be in the eastern part of the Gulf of Alaska, 35 knots, until we get right around the northern part of this low. Towards the Barrens, we have easterly flow around 40 knots there, but dropping down pretty quick towards the Alaska Range, only around 15 knots with a little stronger core of winds coming in the eastern part of the interior, around 25 knots out of that easterly direction, and then back down to 15 to 20 knots as we get up along the Arctic coastline. Taking a look now at our turbulence, as we look in the very far part of the southeastern part of the state, below 6,000 feet for most of the Panhandle area, not quite into the Haines-Skagway area. And then as we look down for the south central area, anywhere from Prince William Sound through Kodiak Island down into the Alaska Peninsula, below 6,000 feet expected there. Some light turbulence along the far northwest part of the state, below 3,000 feet expected. And as we look out over the western Aleutian Islands, below 4,000 feet expected for tomorrow. If you stay with us, we'll be right back with the marine forecast.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining me once again is Eric Stevens from the Geographic Information Network of Alaska, or GINA, based at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Eric, welcome back to the show.
Well, Dave, it's great to be back. Thanks for inviting us again.
Sure thing. And today we want to talk about identifying burn scars. That would be the burned up area after a wildfire when the flames and the smoke are gone. We can see it if you drive by it on the roadway, of course, but from satellite, we can also identify those places on the land, right?
You know it. You know that expression, ouch, that's going to leave a mark?
Yeah.
after you bang your knee getting out of the car. You go,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, the ouch, it's going to leave a mark. That also applies to the landscape. Whenever a wildfire ravages through, it's going to leave a mark on the landscape. After a wildfire burns out, this is called a burn scar.
Okay.
And you can ask yourself, well, that's interesting. We can see a burn scar from space. Then the question is, well, why does that matter?
Okay.
Who cares?
Yeah, fire's over.
Right, the fire is over. We don't need to worry about this anymore. It turns out you kind of do, because burn scars are important. There's this old rule of thumb in the weather business that flood follows fire.
Okay.
The action of the fire in killing off the vegetation, in baking, kiln drying the landscape a little bit, can hinder the land's ability to absorb rainfall. So if you have a fire, especially if it's in complex mountainous terrain.
Right.
This is classic in California. It can happen somewhat in Alaska too. You get a wildfire in steep, hilly, or mountainous terrain, rips off all the vegetation off the landscape. Then 6 months later, there's a big rainstorm, and you get a flash flood in that area. So flood can follow fire. That's why you got to know where the burn scars are. Secondly, a fire needs fuel to maintain itself. So if there's an old burn scar left over from a year or two ago, and then another summer later here in Alaska in the interior, it's a big wildfire season. If there's a fire advancing toward an old burn scar, well, guess what? That old burn scar is going to be tougher terrain for that new fire to get through because there's not as much fuel in that burn scar. So they almost act like a natural fire break. These are a couple of reasons why you need to know where those burn scars are. Alaska Fire Service has limited resources. They want to put their people and their equipment where it does the most good. They need to know, well, this is an area where there's no burn scar. We better put people here because that fire could really run.
So really important for weather forecasters and fire weather forecasters for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But then how do weather satellites actually detect those burn scars?
Ah, good question.
Thanks.
Well, let's turn the Wayback Machine to the summer of 2015. That was a very active year. Got a picture here taken up in the White Mountains. This is one of the fires in progress that summer, and if you look real close, you can almost see Frodo throwing the ring into the volcano there. So that's quite the vision. Well, let's look at a visible image. Here we are in Alaska's interior. This is before the fires got out of the cage in early summer of 2015. Let's zoom into the western interior here. Again, this is a weather satellite image of visible light, what the human eye can see. We're into the middle reach of the Yukon Valley there in the western interior, Galena area. And this is just a beautiful visible day. Nothing much going on. It's in early June before the fires really got active. But then in 2015, the fires got loose, especially in that western interior. Here's another image. The same satellite pass as that visible image, but now we're not quite looking at visible light.
Very different.
There's a slight change here. This image incorporates something called the veggie band. 0.86 micron wavelength. The micron's very tiny, but that wavelength responds to vegetation, the chlorophyll. So trees and grasses reflect that part of the electromagnetic spectrum back to the satellite. And so the satellite sees that. When signal comes at that wavelength to the satellite, we know, there's some vegetation growing there. This is great. You can identify coastlines so easily because you go from vegetation to water. Turns out if you have a burn scar, guess what? You burned away the vegetation, so that's going to show up. We're going to do a before, during, and after kind of look here. And so we're looking at before. So in this image, we got a lot of green out there. That's wonderful. Another fun thing about this kind of imagery is you can see down in the Alaska Range in the southeast corner of the image, it's blue. That's glaciers and snow in the mountains. So this is not really what the human eye can see. This is these wavelengths are beyond human vision, but we've made them look certain colors. So the vegetation looks green. Now let's look at that same kind of satellite recipe, but during the fires. This is in July. The fires are loose. You can see the smoke in the middle of the image, the smearing look of the smoke, and then we can see some clouds that are white. Icy clouds are blue. So this is in July of 2015. The fires are doing their thing. We're burning up millions of acres. Now let's go to September. The fires are out. The audience has left the theater. You know, the event's over, right? We're done. But guess what? Now look at those brown patches.
Look at that.
All of those places are where the fire has burned away the vegetation. So you can see where the fires were. You can add up these perimeters, get acreage burned and such. And so that's good to know. Now remember, flood follows fire, and these are also natural fire breaks. So you need to know where these guys are. In the course of the 2015 summer season, we went from before with not much burn scar in this area to just a couple months later, we can see so much burn scarring on the landscape. What's interesting too about the satellite and looking at burn scars is you realize that burn scars are the gift that keeps on giving. You can forget that a couple of years ago maybe there was a fire in a certain area, but the satellite won't forget. So in the summertime we get wildfires in Alaska, but guess what? In the visible imagery here we can see the burn scars just a little bit, but they're not as prominent as in that veggie band. But then you can't see them at all if you cover them up with snow, right?
Exactly.
So here's an image from the middle of the winter time, and snow on the ground by this recipe looks blue. Again, these are wavelengths of light that the human eye can't really see. We're getting up into the infrared, near infrared, and the way we've assigned colors is if there's snow on the ground or there's a glacier, it looks blue, kind of intuitive. So this is early April of the following year, 2016. We're just about to get into breakup. We got a lot of snow on the ground, and now it's all going to melt. And as the snow melts, then you get our final image here. Doesn't this look familiar? This looks like a lot of what we saw in September of the previous summer. So this is the spring of the next year. The fires themselves might not have overwintered, they're gone, but the fire scar does. And as the snow melts away, and then you have breakup, and then you have green up, whenever the leaves come out, the grass comes back, except in the burned areas, they're having a tough time because everything got burned off the previous year. So you can see these scars even the next summer, multiple years. It depends on what kind of vegetation there is. You know, some of the tussocky tundra grasses, they'll grow back really quick, but to get a forest to come back, that'll take much longer. So these burn scars, eventually the landscape will fill in the burn scar. It will heal itself, if you want to use that metaphor. But for the next few years, you can still keep track of these on satellite. And again, the reason we want to do that is that the burn scar can facilitate a flood, and it can act like a fire break. So there you are, the veggie band.
Tools. So if you're a weather satellite and you're looking at my bowl of vegetables here, you might be able to pick out which one's the pea, which one's the tomato, and which one's the carrot, and apply that information precisely to whatever it is you're working on there. That is really fascinating stuff that we have that capability from so high above the planet Earth, and Alaska for that matter.
Eric? Eat your veggies.
Yes, definitely. I think I will. I'm hungry. Thanks so much for joining us again, Eric, and thank you for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We'll see you right here next time.
Welcome back. We'll take a quick look at the ice edge. Most of the activity starts here from Barrow and down towards the Tin City area. We have all that shore-fast ice is really starting to break up now, especially in the areas from Tin City to Shishmaref and from Point Lay towards Wainwright. Those are some of the most critical areas right now. If you're out there hunting, please be careful. A lot of that shore-fast ice, especially with any offshore flow, is really going to break up fast. For our main marine forecast, starting off in the southeastern part of the state, primarily an easterly flow around 25 knots out over the eastern Gulf, and then dropping down to around 15 knots, northerly flow up to the north, and southeasterly flow as we get down towards Ketchikan and Metlakatla. Then as we move into Thursday, things dropping down a little bit, staying around 25 knots in the southeastern parts of the Gulf of Alaska. But as we get into the inside waters, dropping down to around 10 knots in the central areas, 15 knots further to the south. Seas up to as high as 10 feet out in the eastern parts of the Gulf. For the south central area, primarily an easterly flow, getting up as high as 30 knots in the western Gulf, but even higher in the Shelikof Strait area around gale force winds, 35 knots there. Seas as high as 14 feet in the western parts of the Gulf, dropping down pretty quickly as we get up towards the Prince William Sound area, 15 knots out of a northerly direction there. Then on Thursday, diminishing everywhere, dropping down to 10 to 15 knots for the whole area. Seas diminishing as well down to 6 feet, and primarily a northerly component to the flow. On Wednesday for the Alaska Peninsula, primarily a north direction, somewhere northwesterly as we get out towards the west, 25 to 30 knots there. Highest seas on the Pacific side around 8 or 9 feet. Then on Thursday, dropping down and becoming more westerly flow around 15 knots. Seas still highest on the Pacific side, but dropping down to around 6 feet on Thursday. As you look out over the Aleutian Islands, primarily a west to northwest flow, 10 to 15 knots, a little bit higher on the southern side of Dutch Harbor area, 20 knots there, and as high as 30 knots out of a southwesterly direction near the western Aleutian Islands. Seas out there, 13 feet, that's the highest for this area. Then on Thursday, switching up, becoming southeasterly around 20 knots, and an easterly component to the winds as we move out towards the east, 15 to 20 knots for the most part on Thursday. As we look along the west coast of this state, for most locations, northerly flow 15 to 25 knots, and as we get down by the Pribilof Islands, southwesterly flow 10 knots there. As you look into Thursday, things still staying primarily out of a northerly direction, 15 to 20 knots closer to the coastline. As we get further out towards the west, variable winds 10 knots. Along the Arctic coastline, primarily an easterly flow around 20 knots, picking up to as high as 30 knots as we get to the northwestern part of the state, and then dropping back down to around 15 knots as we get closer towards the Kotzebue Sound area. Then on Thursday, staying out of that easterly flow now, 25 to 30 knots all along the Arctic coastline, and then northerly winds as we get south of Point Hope, around 15 knots there. A recap for our weather for the state: we have our double barrel low down here over the Gulf of Alaska, bringing its frontal system all along the North Gulf Coast tonight, continuing to bring rain, strongest along the coast, but some of the lighter showers making it further inland, going to bring some lighter rain to areas around Bristol Bay, into the south central and the inside waters areas of the Panhandle. Moving up into the interior, not much activity overnight. The thunderstorms that are happening this evening should diminish pretty quickly as we move into the nighttime hours. Then up along the Arctic coast, we are going to see some light snow up there. Still staying pretty cold with the high pressure that is dominating over the Arctic right now. Out over the central and eastern parts of the Bering Sea, going to see some fog developing overnight, sticking around into tomorrow morning. And then our stalled out low by the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some rain into those areas, with its front really stalling out as well, bringing some rain that was over the central Aleutians, pushing out further to the east, but slowing down now. As we move into Wednesday, that low going to hang out and linger over the western Aleutian Islands, bringing more rain, with some areas of fog continuing, especially in the morning time frame for the central and eastern parts of the Bering Sea. We're going to see some lighter shower activity, especially in the afternoon and evening hours from southwest Alaska into southern parts of the interior and the south central, and even in the southeastern part of the state. Afternoon and evening time for the YK Delta area are expecting some isolated thunderstorms to develop tomorrow. And then as we look along the Arctic coastline, fog, especially over the morning time frame, but back to the Gulf, heaviest rain along the Gulf coastline into Prince William Sound area. And with Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.